Dear learners, today we will be talking about kinship. As you all know, kinship has to do with relationships between individuals. Kinship has to do with your family members. Kinship can therefore be about people with whom you are married. It could be through ties of blood or it could be through ties of adoption. So that means when you are talking about kinship, in some ways you are actually talking about your family. In your family, you have married people like your parents. You have people who have a blood relationship with one another, like for example, parents and children. There are also ties of adoption. And more importantly, when you are talking about kinship, it is very important that there has to be a social recognition of these family relationships. And when you say that there has to be a social recognition of these family relationships, what you are actually saying is that society recognizes these kinship relationships. That means society recognizes that yes, these are husband and wives, these are parents and children. Apart from that, sometimes what might also happen is you also have something called fictive kinship relationships. Now, when you are talking about fictive kinship relationships, what you are really talking about is that sometimes in your village or maybe in your community, you may call somebody as a chacha or a kaka or something like that, and those are they, whereas in reality they may not be your kin relatives, but you address them by that. Apart from that, when you are talking about your family, then you can talk about two types of families. Now, these two types of family is something that the sociologist Talcott Parsons spoke about first, and these types of families which you have are the family of orientation and the family of procreation. Now, the family of orientation is the family in which you are born. So, that means the family in which you are as a child, and the family of procreation is the family in which you procreate. So, that means when you are talking about the family of procreation, you are talking about the family, let us say when you start a family, when you get married, when you have your own children, that becomes your family of procreation. This picture actually shows to you a family of procreation as well as a family of orientation. If you look at the family from the point of view of a child, it becomes a family of orientation. If you look at the family from the point of view of the father or the mother, then it becomes a family of procreation. So, that means to sum up, what you are saying is that the types of kinship relationships that you have are of two types. One is an affinal relationship, is one which is based on marriage. So, so that means a husband and a wife are affines to one another. Apart from that, you have consanguinal relationships. Consanguinal relationships are those which are based on ties of blood. So, that means your father is your consanguine, your brother or your sister are your consanguines, your mother is also your consanguine. This picture shows you an affinal relationship of, let us say, a man and his wife. This shows you a consanguinal relationship wherein you have a mother and a child. Now, for example, if you were to look at the Todas of Nilgiris, now why I am giving you the example of the Toda tribe of Nilgiris is because their family, that means their kinship relationships are a little different. They are polyandrous. Polyandrous meaning a woman has several husbands, and this is something which society recognizes. So, that means this kind of an affinal relationship is something which is accepted by society. The question that then arises is that how do you decide the father of the child? Now, as far as the father of the child is concerned, biologically you know who the father of the child is, but what is more important is that socially how do you define the father of the child. And socially what happens amongst the Todas is that the husband who last performed the armorial presentation of bows and arrows is considered to be the father, even though he may not be the biological father, even though he may be dead. Now, the armorial presentation is nothing but something which happens when when a couple gets married amongst the Todas. So, the Toda of the Nilgiris have a family structure, have a kinship structure which is very different from a kinship structure of the kind perhaps which you might find in India, let us say amongst the people of Uttar Pradesh, or let us say the people or some of the societies in Madhya Pradesh, right. Now, apart from that, if you were to look at the type of kinship relationships that you have, so you have primary kin, you have secondary kin, and then you have tertiary kin. Now, primary kin are those members who are directly related to you. Directly related to you meaning those who belong to your family of orientation. These are also labeled as first degree kin relationships. So, for example, a husband and a wife would be a primary kin to one another, and many sociologists and anthropologists actually say that there are 7 types of primary relationships. So, the mother, the father, the husband, the wife, son, daughter, brother, sister, all are primary kin to one another. Secondary kin relationships are those which are related to you through the primary kin, and some of the sociologists and anthropologists have counted about 33 types of secondary kin relationships. So, for example, your father's father, that means your grandfather on your father's side, your mother's father, that means the grandfather on your mother's side, your wife's brother, the wife's sister, the husband's brother, husband's sister, they are all known as your secondary kin members. Tertiary kin members are those who are the primary kin of the secondary kin or the secondary kin of the primary kin. For example, a brother-in-law becomes a secondary kin of his wife, his children and his primary kin become your tertiary kin, and there are about 151 types of tertiary kin members. In kinship, it's very important to learn how to draw diagrams, because when you are talking about such complicated relationships, like for example, secondary kin and tertiary kin, it's always better to represent them diagrammatically. And let's see how you depict them diagrammatically. See, diagrammatically, a triangle represents a male, a circle represents a female, and further, see, a triangle, to repeat again, represents a male, a circle represents a female. When if this male and the female are married to one another, then you have an equal to sign which shows the marriage relationship between the man and the woman. And as we had, just to rewind a little bit, like we had said earlier, it is basically showing that this man and a woman are affines to one another, and they are also primary kin to one another. Now, a vertical line going down and both vertically and horizontally shows you a relationship of descent, meaning that this married couple has a son, which is a triangle, and has a daughter, right. So, this diagram becomes your diagram which represents the primary kin members. Now, in the primary kin members in this diagram, so what you have is, you have a mother, you have a father, and you have a pair of children. Now, in a kinship diagram, what you typically tend to do is that the point of the point of reference of the diagram from which you are labeling the various relationships, that point of reference becomes your ego. So, let us say that the son represents the ego. Then from the ego's point of view, the father, the mother and the sister become your primary kin members. Your secondary kin members would be the father's father, that is your grandfather, would be your mother's father, would be your mother's brother, who would be your uncle, or your mother's aunt, who would again be your aunt, or your father's brother. They would all become your secondary kin members. And secondary kin members, don't forget, from the point of view of the ego, which we had labeled, which the son we had labeled as the primary, as the ego. Now, tertiary kin members would be, let us say, your mother's brother's wife, your mother's brother's children. So, for example, in North India, it would typically mean that your mama's wife, that is your mami, and the mama's children would become your tertiary kin members, right. Now, moving on further, why is kinship very important? As we all know, kinship is very important from the point of view of support. It provides a support structure. Your identity is determined through kinship relationships. It also helps to regulate marriage, and in small scale societies, like for example, we spoke about the Toda of the Nilgiris. We could also talk about, let's say for example, the Nuer in southern Sudan in Africa. We could talk about the Ashanti tribe of Ghana. Now, the reason why I am mentioning tribes, that is simple societies, is because in these societies, the function of kinship is very, very important. But because these societies are small scale societies and they are sustainable economies, so in these societies, kinship relationships become very important in terms of identifying the support structure, in terms of providing security to people, in terms of identifying how you marry one another. So, regulation of marriage is also a very, very important function of kinship. It also has to do with reciprocity. Now, reciprocity, allegiance and inheritance would be in terms of that typically kin members reciprocate towards one another in terms of, let us say, gift giving, in terms of various duties that they perform vis-a-vis one another, reciprocity also in terms of various roles that they perform, right. And inheritance is again a very important function of kinship, because when you, when you are talking about kinship, one of the reasons, one of the ways in which kin groups carry on, one of the ways in which you ensure the continuity of society is through kinship relationships. And kinship relationships, like I said earlier, have to be socially recognized. So, that means if you are talking about social recognition of kinship relationships, it also has to do with inheritance. Who is going to inherit from whom? Will the son inherit from the father, or will the daughter inherit? Or will both the father and mother pass on their property to the son and the daughter? So, those become rules of inheritance. So, that means what you are basically saying here is that kinship becomes very important in terms of ensuring the continuity of society, in terms of regulating society, right. Regulation of society in terms of incest prohibition, regulation of society in terms of, in terms of a lineage, in terms of a clan as well. Now, in Hindi, a lineage is sometimes also called the vansh. In terms of the clan is also referred to as gotra, and I am sure you already know that there are rules of marriage in terms of whom you can marry and whom you cannot marry. For example, a brother and a sister cannot marry one another in almost all societies. Now, when you say that a brother and a sister cannot marry one another, you are talking about incest prohibition. In some societies, what you also have is that first cousins cannot marry one another. For example, a person cannot marry his father's brother's children. That means you cannot marry, let us say, your chacha or your taya's children. Why? Because then that again becomes incest, considered to be incestuous, and there is an incest prohibition. In some societies, on the other hand, it is permissible for a person to marry his first cousins. That means you can marry your father's brother's children, you can even marry your mother's brother's children. Now, that is again depending on the kind of society that you are talking about, right. Now, in modern societies, like let us say, let us say for example in Bihar, or let us say in Uttar Pradesh, where you are talking about the politics. So, in terms of politics also, kinship plays a very important role. For example, you would like to vote for all people who belong to your clan. For example, all Yadavs will vote for one another, or for example, all people who share the same surnames, they would all be voting for one another, and they would all support one another, right. So, kinship plays a very, very important role in simple societies as well as in complex societies. Now, further, when you are talking about kinship, so we have learnt about the family of procreation, we have learnt about the family of orientation, we have learnt about different kinds of kinship relationships, we have also learnt about the, we have also learnt about the important function that kinship performs. Now, the term kinship is very, very cumbersome. I cannot always go on saying, oh, you are my father's brother's mother, or you are my father's brother's son's son. It's very complicated. So, that means you have to have, you have to have kinship terminology. Kinship terminology in terms of how is it? Now, kinship terminology could be in terms of the type of family. It could be in terms of rules of residence. It could be in terms of rules of descent as well. Now, kinship terminology in terms of types of family would be, are you talking about a nuclear family? Are you talking about a joint family? Rules of residence would again be in terms of that after marriage, does a woman go and stay with her husband's family, or does the man go and stay with his wife's family? Rules of descent would be that is the property passed on from the father to the eldest son, or is the property passed on from the father to all his children, or is the property jointly passed on from the patrilineal kin members to the others. And what is patrilineal kin members and others, we will discuss in a little while. So, that means in terms of kinship terminology, what you are saying here is that you could talk about kinship terminology first in terms of linguistic structure. Now, in terms of the linguistic structure, you have an elementary kinship terminology, An elementary kinship terminology is one in which the terms cannot be broken down into more simpler terms. For example, mother, father, brother, sister, these are all elementary kinship terms. Then you have something called derivative kinship terms, then you have descriptive kinship terms. Now, and on the basis of the mode of use also you can have terms of address, you can have terms of reference, you can have on the basis of the range of application, you can have you can have denotative or descriptive terms, and you can have classificatory terms. Now, what do all of these mean? Like I have already told you, elementary kinship terms have to do with simple terms: brother, father, mother, sister, daughter. Derivative terms are those which are coined by joining suffixes or prefixes to the elementary terms. So, for example, the father's father would be grandfather. Then the the father's father, the mother's brother, the sister-in-law, the stepson, all of these become derivative terms which are coined by joining suffixes and prefixes to each other. The descriptive terms would combine two or more elementary terms. For example, the wife's sister's becomes your descriptive term, right? The brother's wife would become a descriptive term. The daughter's husband would become a descriptive term. Now, so that means what you are saying here is elementary is absolutely simple: mother, father, brother, sister. Derivative terms, when you are joining, when you are deriving kinship terminology from the elementary terms. So, for example, you would say grandfather, stepson, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, father-in-law, these all become your derivative terms. Descriptive terms would be when you are joining two or more elementary terms. So, for example, you could say wife's sister, that becomes your descriptive term. So, if you say wife's sister's daughter, that would also become your descriptive term. For example, for many of us, wife's sister's daughter would be nobody but your Masi's daughter, right? Your brother's wife, from the point of view of a man, that means it would be, a brother's wife would be again a descriptive term. Daughter's husband would again be a descriptive term, right? So, that means these three terms, the elementary, the derivative and the descriptive, are in terms of linguistic terminology. You are talking about kinship terminology. Now, in terms of range of application, I said you have denotative terms. So, denotative terms would be, like you are talking about the father, mother, brother, sister. What do you denote, right? So, you are talking about applying this term to only one category, right? That becomes your denotative terms, right? Now, apart from this, when you are talking about classificatory terms would apply to persons in, when you begin to classify your kin relatives. For example, if I was to say, oh, you are my cousin, so what have I done? The term cousin is so confusing in terms of kinship, right? In terms of kinship terminology, it's very simple. You say, all right, you are my cousin. Now, the term cousin could mean so many things. Now, who all do you have as your cousin? Your father's brother's son becomes your cousin. That means your chacha's son or your taya's son becomes your cousin. The father's sister's son becomes your cousin. That means your bua's son, bua's daughters, all of them become your cousins. Your mother's sister's son, your mother's sister's daughter, they all become your cousins. So, you see, this becomes a classificatory kinship terminology in which you are classifying people together, right? Uncle, aunt, all of them are classificatory. And typically in India, you really do not find classificatory kinship terminology to a very large extent, because many of us, many societies do tend to have descriptive terms. So, for example, you would say chacha, taya, kaka, masi, whatever, right? So, that becomes your classificatory term, right? And now, I also mentioned on the basis of mode of use. I said you could have terms of address and terms of reference. Now, terms of address would be how you address me. For example, you say, oh ma'am, or you could say sir. They are not your kin relatives, but it is a term of address. So, for example, you could say chacha, that becomes your term of address. Terms of reference would be your father's brother. Bua would become your term of address, but your term of reference would be your father's sister, right? So, you are talking about kinship in terms of kinship terminology. You can also talk about kinship in terms of rules of descent, succession and inheritance. Now, in terms of descent, meaning how is it that a kin group is being formed? Now, in terms of descent, it could be unilineal meaning it could be patrilineal or matrilineal, meaning property is passed from the father to the son. Matrilineal meaning property is passed from the mother or her mother's family to the children, right. So, for example, the Ashanti of Ghana is an example of a matrilineal tribe. It could also be bilineal. Bilineal meaning property is passed from both the mother and the father, and equal importance is given to the mother and the father. Now, kinship groups on the basis of unilineal descent could be in terms of a family. You already know what a family is. It could be in terms of a lineage. Lineage meaning you know exactly who your lineage members are. So, the father, the son, the grandfather all become your lineage members. A clan is also a kind of a lineage, but a clan is bigger than a lineage. A clan has several lineages, and in a clan you really do not know exactly how descent is to be reckoned. A furry tree becomes several clans together, and a moiety is several furry trees together. So, these are all different types of lineages that you have in terms of the degree of complexity. So, lineage becomes the smallest, clan will have several lineages, a furry tree will have several clans, and a moiety would have several furry trees, right. A lineage, a clan and a furry tree are endogamous. Endogamous meaning that, they are exogamous, not endogamous, they are exogamous, meaning you have to marry outside your lineage, you have to marry outside your clan, you have to marry outside your furry tree. A moiety can be endogamous or exogamous. For example, amongst the todas it is endogamous, meaning you have to marry, you have to marry within your moiety, but you cannot marry within your clan. The Aimol Kuku tribe of Manipur, it is exogamous. That means you cannot marry within your moiety, right. Now, in terms of, so that means we have spoken about descent, we have spoken about inheritance, there is also kinship behavior. There are different patterns of behavior. Now, when you are talking about different patterns of behavior, kinship behavior towards your kin members, this is also defined in terms of kinship relationships. So, you can have a relationship of avoidance, meaning you avoid talking to them very directly. For example, a relationship of avoidance would be one between a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law, right. That becomes a relationship of avoidance. A joking relationship would be one in which you treat the kin member as your equal and you joke with them. For example, in a patrilineal society, you could have a joking relationship between a mother's brother and the sister's son. So, that means you can joke with your mama even though he is of the same age as your father. You could also have, you are talking about behavior in terms of techonomy, you are talking about avunculate, you are talking about amitate. Now, as far as techonomy and avunculate and amitate are concerned, they are not so very common. Now, when you are talking about, or you could also have covade. Now, when you are talking about techonomy, what you are saying is that you are addressing a person through a third person. For example, you could say, a husband is never called directly by his name, but he is referred to as the father of a particular child. Avunculate and amitate means in which the mother's brother and the father's sister respectively are important, and a covade is one in which the husband imitates the behavior of the child of his wife during childbirth and pregnancy. I am sure you can read up more about this in your text. So, basically what we have learnt today is we have discussed about the importance of kinship in terms of kinship terminology, in terms of corporate group formation, in terms of patterns of behavior. We have learnt about different types of kinship groups, and we have also learnt about how to depict kinship diagrammatically. For more clarifications, dear students, you can always read the text. Thanks very much.